categories such as under 12, under 13, under 14, and occasionally under 15. As I said, I've been working in Slavia for this is the end of my third season, and yeah, it's a great club. I'm learning a lot. Before my experience in Slavia, I used to work for a small academy in Taiwan called Masters Football Academy, which was great, working at the basic level of the game in kind of amateur football. So that was the basis of my experience. And then yeah, this is my third season in Slavia. I'm from the UK. I will try. I understand that for some of you, English might be a bit difficult. I will try to speak clearly and slowly. If you have any questions, as Matty said, then please feel free to ask them at the end. We can have a short question and answer session after the presentation. In terms of the presentation, so as Matty said, this is a presentation about small-sided games, and in particular the methodology and the importance of small-sided games. In my opinion, it's perhaps the most important element of a training session, and I will be explaining why I believe that to be the case. Moving on into the presentation, so there are going to be four main elements, four main parts to the presentation. The first part is a definition of what I consider to be small-sided games. So we will define the concept of small-sided games and talk a little bit about what they are. As part of that, I will discuss some variables, so different ways that the small-sided game can differ. Examples such as number of players, age and ability, and the size of the pitch and the areas that we use, and how that might impact certain elements of the small-sided game. Moving on then into the coaching methodology. To me, this is quite an important element of this presentation, in that I will be trying to relate concepts of the small-sided game and how we coach the small-sided game within the session in the context of the English FA model. It's called the four corner model, and I'll also be talking about different coaching styles and intervention techniques. So when we decide to step onto the pitch and stop the game, how I feel that we should be doing that, and some of the considerations and the factors that we need to be bearing in mind when coaching the small-sided game. The third part will be why I believe that small-sided games are important. So I'll be discussing certain positives, of which there are many, in terms of trying to create a football player and in terms of trying to improve your team. And as with any element of football, and particularly football coaching, there are limitations and negatives to those small-sided games. So we'll be discussing that, and I have a case study for you to put that into context as well. Finally, I'll be moving on to the practical application of those small-sided games. So basically trying to find real-life examples from professional football and trying to correlate that to training practices and small-sided games and examples of those small-sided games. And that's it, really. That's going to be the main structure of the presentation. Moving on to the first element. So what are small-sided games? My definition of small-sided games are that they are obviously mini games above 1v1 on small pitches. A question for you, really, to answer in the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Can a 1v1 be considered as a small-sided game? I would be interested to know your opinion on that. So this is something that we will get back to at the end of the presentation, and we can discuss. In terms of what I believe small-sided games are and what they should be. They should focus on the use of a specific skill in a game realistic scenario. And for me, this is the most important element of a small-sided game, and the most important benefit of a small-sided game is that it provides us as coaches and players with the opportunity to practice game realistic situations that players regularly face in a match situation, and giving players the skills and the confidence and the ability to solve those scenarios in a live match. This does mean that in small-sided games, I believe that decision making must be prioritized, and this is in terms of how they are coached, and how the coach goes about coaching a small-sided game. At the forefront of our mind must always be the idea that we are focusing on decision making, because this is the main benefit of a small-sided game. A more specific definition, I would class a small-sided game as being a microcosm of any aspect of the game, be that switching the play, be it forward runs off the ball, movement off the ball, be that 2v2, 3v3, team defending, any kind of aspect of the game, passing, shooting, any kind of aspect. A small-sided game can be a microcosm, so a mini version of that aspect of the game. And as I said, it should encourage the player to solve problems using the techniques and the skills that they have developed in other parts of the session. You will see that the pyramid at the bottom of the slide, this really is the methodology of the English FA, and it's something that I agree with. So what we try to do in our sessions in England, I'm not sure about the Czech Republic, but in England we try to give the session one overriding one general topic. So that could be short passing, it could be long passing, shooting, 1v1 defending, could be any facet of the game. And we start with the technique. So technique is usually a focus on the detail, the technical details, and crucially, this is usually done without opposition. Then once the player is confident with that technique, then you would progress onto the skill, and the skill is the technique, but now in an opposed situation. So you would add defenders and difficult elements with which to challenge your players, and how well they can perform that technique under pressure. And then finally, the last element of the session will be a small-sided game, and the small-sided game is basically taking that technique, taking the skill, so what the player learns under pressure, and then trying to apply that to a small-sided game. So, for example, if we were taking the technique of shooting, so your shooting exercise would perhaps be an unopposed exercise to focus on technique, whereby the player would only focus on that technical aspects of the ball contact, the surface with which to strike the ball, the biomechanics, and the basic technical elements of shooting. Then you would take it to the skills, so you would include perhaps some live situation where the striker is put under some kind of pressure from a defender, be that passive or active. And then in the small-sided game, you would create a situation whereby the player can make the decision of whether to execute that skill and that technique, or perhaps to use something else in the game to solve the problem. For example, in a shooting exercise, perhaps the player will decide to shoot, or you give him some kind of option of whether he passes the ball instead, and whether he takes on the 1v1 perhaps instead of taking a shot. And so you really put that skill of shooting in a match realistic situation where he has to make decisions about when to use the skill and in which situation that's appropriate. Of course, when we are talking about small-sided games, it's a very broad topic, really. There are lots of different considerations that we have to bear in mind when we are constructing our small-sided games. And in fact, whether to use small-sided games and which small-sided games to use. Top of the priority must be your players, and so you should be considering the age and the ability of the players. So, for example, if you are coaching an under-8 or under-9 team, of course, if you then move into a small-sided game that is perhaps 7v7 or 8v8, and it's very complicated in a very small area where they perhaps don't have the technical ability to keep possession and to have success, then this is obviously not a constructive use of a small-sided game. Of course, numbers of players as well. So, as I said, it's very much dependent on the age and the ability of your players. So, for example, if you have an under 15, under 16 professional team, perhaps you can then have a 7v7 situation, and you can focus then on your topic through that 7v7. However, if you are coaching a younger category, or perhaps you're coaching an amateur team or a team with lesser ability, obviously you have to set them up for success. So perhaps you might want to create some kind of overload. So therefore you might have a 6v4 or a 6v3 or whatever that might be. And you might do that by including Magic universal players playing for the possession team. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. Of course, the size of the playing area as well. So we will talk a little bit later about the differences between different numbers of players, but also the playing area and what we choose to use is directly going to affect the effectiveness of your small-sided game. For example, if you are focused on switching the play in your session and your players are in your pitch, is very narrow, the size is too small, perhaps your players won't then get a realistic scenario of switching the play or using wide areas. So perhaps you might make a pitch in a small-sided game that is wider than it is long. Or you might think about even using different kinds of shapes. I know that some coaches are using diamond pitches to focus on certain elements. Some coaches use octagonal, hexagonal pitches as well. So really, one of the benefits of the small-sided game is that we can be creative in the size and the shape of the playing area that we're using. We can experiment in order to get the right results, depending on the topic that we're trying to introduce. And the final variable really is that I would like to focus on is the use of goalkeepers. This one is a slightly controversial topic really, because there are lots of examples of small-sided games, perhaps where the goalkeepers aren't as active in the game, and there are certain situations where you don't need to use a goalkeeper in order to focus on your point that you want to get across in your session. For example, if you're focused on short passing and possession, perhaps you don't need then the distraction of a goalkeeper. Whereby the players might be tempted to think about shooting instead of the element, the focus of passing in the small-sided game. So you have to be very careful about whether you're using goalkeepers, also whether you're using Magic players, these universal players that can add different elements and different dynamics to the same small-sided game. But it's all about experimentation and finding out what works and really thinking about the logistics of your small-sided game and how it will affect your players and how it will play out. The above decisions really and the above factors should be considered in the context of two main questions. The first one is, what do I want my players to gain from the session and the small-sided game? And this, I believe that this is a problem in a a lot of, not just on an amateur level, but also on a professional level, is that you have a lot of academies that run sessions that are very disjointed, in terms of the coaching team not really understanding and not really having any kind of focus in terms of what they want to achieve from the session. So you might have a warm-up that focuses on short passing. You might then move on to something that involves some kind of shooting, and then maybe in the game at the end, if it is coached, you might get some kind of focus on width or rotation of position or movement. And so you've got three elements of that session in an hour and a half, and you've got three different separate ideas. So it means that really there's no special focus on that session. Whereas if you say to your players at the start, okay, today we will work on short passing, and every single element of your session works towards short passing, or the focus is on short passing, then you get a far more concentrated, far more focused session. In that way, you can then think about how you want your small-sided game to fit into that topic. So this is something that we as coaches have to be understanding, that we must make sure that we are focused on our reason for having this session. Why do we want to have the session? What do my players need to work on? And then focusing every element of the session, including the small-sided game, on the session. So the second part is, will my players enjoy success from the small-sided game? So you have to be very, very careful with this, and that, again, your approach has to be player-centric, in that we want our players to succeed. We want to challenge them, yes, but we want them to succeed. So if I have an under-7 or under-8 team, and I'm trying to play an 8v8 on a 25-30 meter by 40 meter pitch, of course it's going to be too small for them to be able to make decisions effectively. They're not going to have enough time to practice the skill or the technique that you've been working on with them. So you have to make sure that the parameters, the variables of your small-sided game are appropriate to your players in terms of them gaining success from that small-sided game. So the preparation and the planning is obviously important in that respect. But everything that we do has to be player-centric, and not focus so much on the coach. Of course, you have to coach what you feel comfortable coaching within your knowledge base and within your vision, your philosophy and your tactical vision, but you must also make sure that your players have success with that. And as I said, like any effective session, small-sided games must be focused and goal-oriented. So if you are running a session, a small-sided game, about shooting, most of your coaching points, most of your decisions and your challenges that you put to your players will be based on shooting, and perhaps not so much of a focus on defending or passing or something else. So you have to make sure that the small-sided games are focused, or they won't be as effective. And there are some examples really for the kinds of factors that I was talking about, the types of variables. If you look at the first diagram here, the first exercise, you'll see that all three of these exercises are examples of small-sided games that work on, or can work on, switching the play. You will see that in this exercise we have a 6v6 in the middle, so even numbers, and then on the outside we have the two wide players for each team. And in this small-sided game, the idea is that play is directional, and that teams must use the wide areas, the wide players, in order to score, to get success. So how you choose to do that, whether you set challenges that they must switch the play at least once from one player to the other, whether you give some bonus points, is entirely up to you. Obviously, the conditions and the challenges in that small-sided game will change depending on your focus and what you want to get from the game. Talking a little bit about the suitability of this exercise. if you look at, I mean, if you're talking about 8v8, as this effectively is, then is this going to be appropriate for under 7, under 8, under 9, even under 10 and under 11? Probably not. It's quite complex. There are lots of factors to bear in mind, lots of decisions for the player to make for certain age categories and for certain abilities. This is obviously going to be overload for them. It's very difficult for them to understand and to be able to process all of these factors and all of these situations in this small-sided game. For under 15, under 16, under 17, this is obviously going to be a lot easier to do that. So we have to think about the suitability to the players that we're coaching. Obviously, there are certain ways that we can change, we can alter the small-sided game to make sure that it's perhaps a little bit more simplified for younger categories and for players of lesser ability. So perhaps you might want to take out a few of these players here and play a 3v3 and have the two wide players as neutrals and then play on 2 pitches possibly. This obviously makes the session and the small-sided game a little bit higher intensity, lots more ball touches, as we'll talk about later, and it includes it's more inclusive for younger players, and perhaps the scenarios and the situations are a lot easier for the players to understand. 6v6 in the middle is very complicated and very difficult for younger categories, arguably. And also, you'll notice that in this exercise we've got the 2 goalkeepers. So for the older categories, perhaps a little bit more advanced, you might want to think about different outcomes from your small-sided game. So we work on switching, or in this case, you could work on wide play, finishing from crossing, and then perhaps you might want, with the 2 goalkeepers, to then focus more on the movement. So what happens after you switch the play and the movement with which to attack the ball in the box, and movement off the wide player. So this small-sided game is obviously very adaptable, but we have to bear in mind our players. If you look at the second option here, more simplified, lots more space for your players, so effectively 2v2 in the middle, and you have a lot more time and space for decision making. In this exercise, we've taken the 2 big goals out and we've added 4 small goals. In this case, you can get a different focus perhaps on penetration. So the decision making of when we switch the play and when we go direct, when we try to play through the middle. This obviously adds a decision making element for your players and adds for a little bit of creativity. And the potential here, because it's a 2v2, perhaps with younger categories, with less able players, you might want to consider adding some neutral magic players in order to help the attacking team, dependent on the focus of your session, of course. Remember, we want to try to ensure success for our players. If you look at the third option here, so the third, again, we're focused on switching of the play, but this is a far more simplified version. So in this, perhaps you would want to focus more on the detail of the body position, the movement, only working in this 2v2. We've done this exercise before with our under 11s, and we divided the square into four sections. And so you're really focused on the movement off the ball to receive, to then switch the play. And so this, because it's a smaller area, because there are smaller numbers, we can then focus more on the technical details within that small-sided game. So again, it depends on the focus of your session, whether you want more detail in terms of a technical ability, or if you want more tactical detail in terms of the first option here. Again, depends on your players, depends on the focus of your session. But the most important thing is that the small-sided game is focused, and so the coach knows exactly what he wants to get from the session. And then designs the small-sided game accordingly. Just going to take a drink. Okay, so I feel that that's really enough in terms of answering what small-sided games are. Just want to really move on to the methodology behind the small-sided games. So in this section, we will look at more the idea of how we coach. And as I explained in the introduction, in this section, I will be using the English essay four-corner model. And you can see examples of the four-corner model here in the diagram. So we've got technical, and this obviously includes technique. There's also a tactical element to this as well. So I've named this section Tech-Tac, so technical and tactical together in this red section here. You have 3v3, 4v4, and you can have different numbers as well, different kind of numerical advantage, numerical disadvantage, etc. Then you have the psychological. Psychological is more about the individual. So their learning style, decision making is a key element of this in terms of the small-sided game. And yeah, the learning style, so how they learn, of course, different players, different kids as in working in academy, different kids have different ways of learning. So the psychological element to a small-sided game is important. You have the physical aspect as well, and you have the social aspect. Social, I feel it's neglected a little bit in Czech Republic, in that this is the player's relationship to other players, to teammates, to opposition, and different ways that we can encourage more connection between players. You will see that in the second diagram here, you've got some examples of they've divided these four corners into, so you've got your doing, which is your technical, tactical, and your physical. You've got your skills here, so psychological, tech. You've got thinking as well, different elements that they've divided into. The beauty of the small-sided game is that a small-sided game that is effectively coached is able to hit all four corners at once. So it works on all four elements of the four-corner model. Just quickly moving through, so you've got the physical considerations. So you've got the recreation of match realistic physical demands. So obviously your movement to receive the ball in a small-sided game, your acceleration, your agility, coordination, all of these factors that are important in a normal game are recreated in a small-sided game. You've also got the consideration that reducing the number of players from 11v11 to, say, 3v3 or 4v4 adds an element of intensity. So the players are obviously much more involved. They have to do 2, 3, 4 different roles, as opposed to 1 or 2 roles potentially in an 11v11 game. High number of changes of direction, more dynamic small-sided game with and without the ball. And the smaller area also means that players are kind of forced to use their body and to use their body to protect the ball, and in one-on-one duels with opposition players. Of course, when we are talking about the physical elements, there are lots of different ways that the coach can change the small-sided game in order to get the most out of the game in terms of the physicality and the physical element. So you can look at the intensity as being appropriate to the age and the ability of players. Obviously, changing the size of the pitch, changing the amount of players that are on the pitch is going to do that. Important thing that I learned when I came to Slavia is the importance of regular intervals. So the key of a small-sided game, really, there are two factors, two sides, and you have to tread the line between them. So you have the need to maintain high quality. So you need high quality, but you also need to make sure that your players experience realistic physical challenges, i.e. performing with fatigue. So when they're tired, being able to execute skills effectively. But also you have to avoid the burnout so that they can improve the technical and the tactical aims. If the players are too tired or they're injured, then of course you're running the risk of hindering the development of your players in that small-sided game. So it's important that we bear that in mind. And as I said, the size of the areas and the conditions, challenges, the number of players, the rotation of players. So do you have 3 teams and you're rotating so that players get a rest? Do you have 2-minute intervals whereby you stop the game after 2 minutes and you perhaps do a little bit of coaching so that your players can get a breather, can rest, which is something that we do quite often in Slavia. These are all considerations to make sure that we get the best out of the small-sided game in terms of the physicality. The technical and the tactical, I would say that in terms of the tactical, the small-sided game is obviously your biggest opportunity to improve your players and your team. You have such situations as positional awareness and off-the-ball movement. So players now, as opposed to a skill or a technique, players now have to think about their position in relation to other players. Obviously with younger categories, that's a lot more difficult. Younger players are usually more selfish. They only focus on themselves. And so getting them to think about other people and other players on the pitch is a challenge. And different ways of moving, both to create space for yourself, so movement to receive the ball, but also movement to create space for other players as well. This is something that we can gain from the small-sided game. Creation of overloads, so different ways that we can create advantages and disadvantages on the pitch, and then the problem solving that goes with those situations. So can we create a 3v2 on the side of the pitch? And then once we've got that 3v2, how different ways, different movements, perhaps some overlaps, underlaps, some different combinations then to solve those problems. As I said, one of the key aspects of a small-sided game is that it allows us to, or the players to solve problems that they encounter in regular matches, regular match situations. Rotation of position and positional responsibilities. This is vital for me because you have a lot of instances in a 4v4 game, for example, a small-sided game, where one of your players might have to play 3 or 4 different positions. So he might be a defender, but he might have to go out to the touchline to defend the opposition player, and then he takes on the responsibility of becoming a fullback. So the different positional demands on that, where does he show him? How does he defend in that situation? The same with one of your strikers, maybe in a 5v5 game, maybe we'll have to go out into a wide area to receive the ball, thus becoming a winger. How does he then solve the positional, or how does he gain that positional intelligence and has practice at being a winger? And so these kinds of rotations of positions, it's very much like the Ajax total football style, where you give players different experiences in different positions. And this happens almost naturally in a small-sided game, is that players are invariably drawn out and pulled out to different positions. And so they have kind of experiences of those different positions in one game. And obviously, if we're talking about technical demand, you've got the technical demand in smaller spaces in theory. So it could be something like the first touch, one touch finishing, perhaps if you're working on your strikers and they don't have a lot of time in the box. This is obviously a realistic scenario in a match, that they perhaps don't have time in the box. And so that increases the challenge of, can we finish with one touch? Can we finish with two touches? Is your ball control in and around the box effective? All in tight spaces, and also the weight and timing of passes. And there are lots of ways that the coach can change the small-sided game in order to get the most out of the players in terms of their technical and tactical intelligence and ability. So you could introduce different challenges in the small-sided game. For example, you could limit touches. In England, this is a controversial idea, but perhaps in the attacking areas of your small-sided games, introducing 1 and 2 touch rules or challenges could help your players to become perhaps a little bit more inventive, creative, and more intelligent in those areas, in those zones. Movement limitations. So this is where you might say to a player, okay, you must stay in this half of the small-sided game. And so then that places challenges on how can he move to receive the ball? How can he influence the game in that scenario? It might be something as simple as saying to your wide players, you're working on width, maintaining width as your topic. It might be something as simple as making 2 zones in wide areas and making sure that your players, your teams must have at least 1 or 2 players in those wide zones when their team has the ball. Yeah, it could be something as simple as that. So using different zones. Conditions and challenges set by the coach to encourage tactical intelligence. So as I said, encouraging different numbers of touches in different areas then challenges your players to solve problems. And you can very much give those problems to the players, and you would perhaps be surprised at the ways in which they solve those problems. It could be something about when and where to pass. As I said, as I've written here, switching the play, penetration in certain areas. So where do we try to play forwards in the middle? Where do we play in wide areas? When and where and why and how? All of these decision-making factors and these problem-solving kind of criteria are involved in the small-sided game. And that's obviously dependent on your tactical philosophy. So in most professional clubs, you have a tactical philosophy where the players know, or the coaches know, the end product. So for example, we went to Red Bull Salzburg last year, and they were talking about their tactical philosophy. They're very direct, play a very direct player. Their priority is to get the ball to the striker as quickly as possible. Therefore, in your small-sided game, that would then be focused on that philosophy, getting your players to play in a certain way and to give them the options and the opportunities to implement the tactical philosophy. Of course, the size of the areas we've talked about before as well. So using different areas, different shapes, different sizes can help your players to increase their technical and tactical abilities. And ultimately, the coach's job is to allow creativity and problem solving, and allow your players to be expressive and to solve the problems by themselves. I think that particularly in modern football, the game is now moving towards players having to be almost special to survive at the highest level, and this means that they have to find different ways to solve problems. defenders are becoming smarter, and so attackers have to be smart, and then obviously the two play off against each other. So it's important as coaches that in the small-sided games that we don't have one way of solving the problem, that we allow the players to solve the problem in different ways and encourage that diversity. The psychological demands of the small-sided game. So the pressure of making decisions with little time and little space. This is important for the player's development. Touches and time. So how many touches do I have? How much time do I have when I receive the ball? The stress and pressure of winning and losing. Obviously, the small-sided game is competitive. You get a winner and a loser, and how the player deals with that at the end of the game and during the game as well. Confidence and experience in handling match scenarios, so that players are used to losing in key moments, or that things are going wrong. How do we act? How do we the experience of problem solving in terms of handling difficult situations. Concentration, which is a problem, definitely a problem in our under 11 category. Getting players to concentrate in a dynamic environment is difficult. Players switch off, especially younger players. They switch off. The small-sided game is obviously a place where players have to concentrate. They have to be switched on for as long as possible. And finally, anticipation, game intelligence through visualization and repetition. So if a player experiences the same scenario again and again and again, then they can anticipate how that scenario is going to play out, and they can react accordingly. And this is all feeding towards the idea of game intelligence, understanding, reading the game, having players such as Iniesta, Xavi, Messi, these players, De Bruyne, they operate 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of everybody else. And this is through, I believe, through small-sided games and being in those situations and having that repetition. There are a number of ways that the coach can help to build psychologically, players psychologically in a small-sided game. So as I said, allowing freedom of expression. You can guide decision making. So you could perhaps say to a player, okay, perhaps this is not the best idea at this time. Or you could phrase it as, what do you think is the best, or what could you have done in this situation? What's an alternative decision that you could have made? It's a difficult balancing act, because you want the player to be expressive, you want the player to be creative, but also you have to give them some kind of guidance and some kind of context. And it's basically giving advice and not always instruction. The beauty of football is that there are more than one way of solving the same problem. And it's important as coaches that we understand that we're not always right, and that perhaps players occasionally see things, see more ways to solve the problem than we do. So it's about having that humility to accept that players sometimes will make decisions that you don't agree with, but can still get you to the same end product. So allowing for more than one outcome to encourage decision making. So different ways to win, and using different coaching styles that we will move on to later, and experimenting and being adaptable, trying out different methods with which to challenge your players psychologically. And finally, social. So the social element, obviously in a small-sided game, more so than with a technical exercise in the session. You get that communication with teammates in a fast-paced environment, so they have to organize each other. Usually you get leadership, so whereby one player will take control and will organize his teammates, and so this is often neglected or forgotten by a lot of coaches. but the small-sided game allows your team to be independent from you, in that they can organize themselves and they can communicate effectively. No matter which age group, it's important that players are independent and they take ownership, so that they don't rely on the coaches too much. Remember, we want independent and creative problem solvers in our team. So we have to trust them sometimes to do that by themselves. Reaction to different scenarios, again, winning and losing. How do we react to that? Do we criticize our teammates? Do we build them up? And are we constructive, or are we defeatist? Are we positive or negative? Teamwork, so work ethic and tactical awareness, so covering positions, pressing, working hard together for the team, and taking ownership and responsibility for events in the game. So if you make a mistake, one of your teammates makes a mistake, or something happens in the game, the reaction to that as a team. And there are ways in which the coach can help that. So you can facilitate ownership of the game for the players. This is something that we've talked about in our age category recently, where you don't make all the decisions for them. So you allow the players to make their own decisions occasionally in the session, whereby you might say to them, okay, today we have 14 players, which formation do you want to play? And they choose their own formation, they choose their own, where the players play, and they choose their own style. Do you want to be direct? Do you want to play a possession game? And you give them ownership of that, and you guide them through that discovery of the different kind of ways that they must react to those, or the different ways to act on those philosophies and those decisions. And allowing players, to create their own rules, and to make decisions independently, setting them challenges. So you could say to one team, okay, you in a regular 4v4 or 5v5, you could say to one team, okay, you're winning by 2 goals and it's the Champions League final, there are 10 minutes left. What do you want to do about it? And get them to make a decision. In the same way, you might go to the other team and say, okay, you're 2-0 down with 10 minutes to go, and then, or 2-0 up, or whatever, and to get them to solve those problems. So there are lots of ways that we can influence a small-sided game. Moving on then to the coaching styles. This section is mainly to do with intervention, so how we intervene in the session, and actually if we intervene in the session. So we've got how many times do we stop the small-sided game? We've got football as education or as a game. This is important. Do we want our players to only have fun, or do we want to teach them something? Are they learning football? And this depends on kind of where your players, whether you're a professional football academy or you're playing for fun. This is something that you have to bear in mind as a coach in terms of how many times you stop the small-sided game and how much you coach. The clarity of vision of the coach. So you'll see the quote in the bottom corner of the presentation here. So you can see looking at everything and seeing nothing. So a lot of coaches will watch the session, but they will watch too many things, and then they will just step in and solve the first problem that they see. We have to observe the small-sided game and make sure that when we're stepping into the game to stop the game, that we are stopping for the right reasons, and that our ideas are clear over what we've seen and how we want to improve it. And that means that you're really looking for repeated mistakes. So if one player makes one mistake one time, that doesn't mean that we have to go in and intervene. But if perhaps your players make the same mistake 3, 4, 5 times, that's when perhaps you you want to go in and try to intervene and to help. There's this quote here: "The game is the best teacher." A lot of coaches, lazy coaches, say this, that the game is the best teacher. Basically, just let them play. Whilst I agree that the game is the best teacher in terms of allowing players, as we talked about, the freedom to make decisions in a match realistic situation, you can't just allow the kids to play and then expect them to be perfect or to develop their game naturally. It's a little bit like if I was teaching English and I made my student watch an English movie. It doesn't mean that they will learn English, but as my responsibility as an English teacher, I have to sit down with them and explain the grammar point, explain the ways in which that they should learn English using this movie. And so these are all the factors that we have to think about before we stop the game. Once we've decided to stop the game, we then think about how we stop the game. There are lots of different methods of communication. And so you have talking, of course. You can bring one player over to the side and talk to them. You can stop the session and you can talk to the whole team. You can talk to individual players and you can explain some solutions to them. You can use a tactics board, obviously the visualization. So using tactics boards to explain different tactical concepts in the small-sided game might also be effective. And you might also demonstrate as well, so a physical demonstration. So there are lots of ways in which we can communicate. We can communicate with one player, small groups, or a whole team, the whole session. Obviously, that's the coach's decision, bearing in mind what he or she has seen, and depending on the issue and the players, there are lots of factors with this. The coaching points. So the coaching points must be focused. So again, we talked about this at the start. If your small-sided game, if your session is based on finishing, and you are coaching a small-sided game, perhaps it's not the best decision then to go into the small-sided game and make coaching points about passing or about switching or about something that's not related to your topic. So being focused on that topic and only dealing with coaching points relating to that topic will help you to be more focused. It will help your players to understand your coaching points more effectively, and it will make the small-sided game a lot more efficient. And we also have lots of different coaching styles. So as you will see from the next slide, there are lots of ways in which we can intervene, lots of ways in which we can coach. This is also from the English FA, and you can see that there are, in this visual, in this diagram, you can see there are 5 different kind of coaching styles. You've got things like trial and error, where you're using words such as try, so try to decide, and you're allowing your players to make mistakes, and they learn through making mistakes. You've got the command section here. The command is used quite a lot in Czech Republic from what I've seen, and it's where you demand something from your players. So I want you to do this. This is how I want you to do it. This is more of a coach-led style. Observation and feedback, which is something that I haven't seen in Czech Republic so much, is that when perhaps you pull a player out of the game and you talk to him about what he can see, and they try to learn from each other. So you might take one of your strikers off and you might put another player in his position, and you might tell him to observe good and bad behavior in another player, allowing your players to learn from each other, but guided by the coach, of course. Question and answer, we use quite a lot in our sessions in Slavia. So we're asking questions of the players. So okay, this is a situation. How can we solve this problem? Why is this the best solution? And guided discovery. So things like the players will show you, they will try to solve the problem themselves. Yeah. So you've got things like show me how to react positively if you lose possession. So you've given them a challenge, and then they try to solve the problem themselves. So there are lots of different ways that you can intervene as a coach in the small-sided game, and the key really is understanding your players, how they learn effectively. Perhaps with a younger category, guided discovery is perhaps not such a great idea because the players don't have the experience or the context with which to learn, whereas trial and error might be a better option with the younger category because they're going to make mistakes anyway, and you don't really get the authority of a command. This is how you should be. So perhaps that will make your players feel a little bit more relaxed. So it's all about your style, about your players' styles, and experimenting really. Perhaps in one session, in one small-sided game, maybe you will use 3, 4, 5, all 5 of these techniques. In terms of stopping and intervening, there is a very clear methodology, I feel, in terms of how we intervene. So when we've decided that we will stop the session, stop the small-sided game, the most important element of this is that we observe. So we watch effectively. We're not just stopping the game for the sake of stopping the game and because we want to say something, but we're watching and making sure that our points are relevant and that when we stop the game, that it's correct and it's necessary. Once we've decided to intervene, then we have a decision, or we have a certain methodology of how we do that. So we stop the game, stop, freeze, we recreate the situation. So if you feel that a player perhaps could have made a different decision, you rewind the play, and so they get to see and they get to experience that decision making, and everybody gets to see that problem. They visualize the problem. So you go back and you recreate the problem. Then you find some resolution. At this stage, resolving, you can refer back to the coaching styles. So you might choose one of those different 5 intervention styles to then resolve the issue. And then importantly, that you rewind the play again and then you restart it. So this process, it looks like it's very slow, but in reality, the process must be fast and it must be efficient. The delivery must be concise and efficient as well. So we don't need to talk for 5, 6, 7 minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes, get in there, make your point, and then get out. If the players haven't understood it, then of course, maybe you need to go back and you need to do it again and go through the same process. But really, it should be 1 or 2 minutes that we go in to deliver the point. The ball should be moving all the time. A lot of coaches I see in the small-sided game, they stop the session and they just speak. They speak and nobody moves. They just speak and they think that this is enough. But especially younger kids, they learn through visualization and actually doing something. If the ball is moving, then they're interested, they're focused, they're concentrated, and you show them instead of just telling them. You're also showing them the ball is moving all the time. And finally, allowing the players to consolidate the information. So you're backing up your information that you've given them by rewinding the play to make sure that they visualize that. So there are lots of different benefits, different positives that you get from a small-sided game. I feel that the most important positive is the realism. So it allows the players to experience the game situations in training sessions. You've got game intelligence, so it develops decision making. Physical demands that we've talked about as well. Whether they're accurate to the game, we will talk about shortly. You have tactical awareness as a team and an individual, dealing with pressure and intensity, technical demands in small spaces, fun. It's also fun for your players, so they get bonding experiences together. Winning and losing makes them closer together, your players closer together. And also it's participation. In a regular 11v11 game, you might have some players that are not so involved in the game, but if it's 3v3, 4v4, smaller area, you get more touches and you get more participation. After this webinar, you can see that I've included a link to an interesting video. This is of various Premier League managers. I think there's Marco Silva, Pep Guardiola, I think Ralph Hasenhüttl as well, I think. They talk about the importance of small-sided games, so you can check that out after the webinar. There are limitations to the small-sided games. One of the biggest negatives, or one of the biggest problems with a small-sided game, is the number of ball touches. This really is quite a controversial topic because there are two ways of looking at it. Okay, there's the idea that ball touches will help with technique and with certain skills. Obviously, if you pass the ball against the wall 300 times, there will be some kind of improvement in your technical ability and your technical proficiency. However, the ball touches that you get in a small-sided game, some would argue that they are more realistic and that they are more appropriate to the game. So kicking a ball against the wall and working on technique is not the same as being in a live environment and having to perform these skills under pressure. The second danger of a small-sided game is that they can become unstructured. This is obviously our job as coaches, that we should try to add structure, as much structure as possible to the small-sided game, but occasionally they can be a little bit messy, especially with younger categories and perhaps amateur teams. So we have to be very careful about making sure that our small-sided games still add value and are still beneficial to our players in terms of providing structure. And the final limitation, surprisingly, is the physical demands. You could argue that they're not realistic to the full game. You can see here that there is a graph. This is from, I think it's Barca Innovation Hub. I think it's Barcelona, and I think they did some research about the effects of small-sided games, the physical effects of small-sided games. You can see that the graph on the side here, the blue is the distance. This is the distance covered in a game, in 11v11 game. You also have the second section here is the average distance covered. You've got a distance covered in terms of the 4v4 small-sided game at the same time frame as the 11v11, and you've also got 6v6. So you can see that in terms of the distance covered, it's not too dissimilar to the average from a 11v11 game. However, your biggest issue really is, if you look at the red line, this is the distance recorded at the highest speed, so high speed movements. And this doesn't really recreate the speed that is produced in an 11v11 game. So your movement, you're producing short, sharp movements, but they're obviously over a smaller area. So whether that is relevant to the game is obviously up for discussion. I've provided a hyperlink for this graph and this study, so you can check that out after the webinar as well. And oh, I've got a problem. There's always going to be. Right, there we go. Yeah, so moving on to, so you can see basically that this is another study, a small-sided game study. At the top, you have the parameters of the study. So they did 2v2, 3v3, and a 4v4 scenario here. And although the dimensions of the pitch are a little bit different, you have, what they've tried to do is to make sure that the small-sided game area is the same for each player. So this is a constant. And really what I wanted to show you from these statistics is the variety that you get from the small-sided game. So you can see that in the blue here, the blue statistics, these are the percentages of the successful passes. So you can see that in the 2v2, you've got a 56% success rate, here 64%, and here around 64%. So if you were focused on possession, or if your topic was passing kind of topic in your small-sided game, then perhaps having a 4v4 or 3v3 would then be better than having 2v2. However, if you look at the balls lost statistics here, the balls lost in a 2v2 were higher than in a 3v3 and a 4v4. So if you were looking at transition and a topic such as transition, perhaps in that case having a 2v2 would then be more beneficial to you than having 3v3 or 4v4. So this shows you that different types of small-sided games and the different variables will have effects on your small-sided game and how you want to focus on specific games, depending on what you want to get from your session. Moving on to the final part of the presentation. So I wanted to kind of put the small-sided games in the context of real life situations. You'll see at the top here, I've included also a hyperlink for this, but you can see that you've got a game. This is quite a famous clip. I think it's Villarreal against Valencia. And what eventually happens is that you have a little bit of possession play around here, and then they switch the play over to the other side, over to this player here. So you've got a small kind of a rondo exercise, which you could class as a small-sided game. And you've got a kind of a 4v4 plus 1 that I've included in my diagram here. So you've got 4v4 plus 1, and then what I've included is some kind of stimulus. So trying to play the ball into one of these 4 small-sided goals, these small goals here. So you've got progression 1 in this exercise would be teams play 5 passes and they can then earn 2 points by scoring in any of the 4 goals. So you've got a little bit of possession and then some kind of switching or some kind of movement, playing the ball out of that pressure zone, which would be recreating the same situation as this example here. And then you've got the second progression. So teams play 5 passes and must score in the goals in the opposite half to where the 5th pass is received. So that's obviously adding a different element, making it more challenging for your players. There's also the possibility that you might want to include a big goal here and a big goal here, take away the 4 small goals and play with goalkeepers. Then it becomes more multi-dimensional, whereby the goalkeeper would then have to play the role of switching the play potentially to the other side of the zone. So as an example of a practical application, you can see that this is obviously a realistic scenario, and then you've got the small-sided game that then helps to recreate that scenario in a training session in a small-sided game. So that's the first practical application. The second example, again, there's a hyperlink included, but we've done this exercise numerous times with our categories in Slavia, and you can see that this exercise works as a 4v4 plus 2. So there are 2 magic players in there, and this exercise works on penetration, forward runs without the ball, and forward passes. And you can see the example here, the real life example that we're trying to play penetrative passes through the defensive line, and the movement that is then required from your players to stay on side and to take advantage of that situation. The exercise here is that teams play 5 passes and then they release a player into the finishing zone, the red zone here. And then the progression to that is that the play becomes directional. And to make it realistic, the strikers have 2 touches or occasionally 1 touch to finish after being released into the red zone. The 2 lines, the red lines here, they are offside lines. Yep. So that's another practical example of how we can use a small-sided game to recreate a situation, a real-life situation. And then finally, defensive topic. So this is a 3v3 plus 2 target players. Again, we've done this numerous times in our sessions in the academy at Slavia. You've got 3v3 in the central area here, and then you have a target player with which to try to hit between the 3 gates, the red, yellow, and blue gates. And you can see an example at the bottom. This is Atletico against Real, I think. And you've got the example of the 3v3 situation with a recovering defender here, and how these 3 players work together to deny the space to play in behind. So this is working on the 3v3 defensive compactness and working as a unit. And again, you'll see that this small-sided game is or it correlates directly to a real-life example. In terms of the presentation, that's pretty much finished. I just wanted to ask if you have any questions or comments, then I'm happy to answer them. And that's it, really.
Yeah. John, great presentation. I have maybe first question. If any others questions, just don't hesitate to write them down to chat. I just would like to ask, where do you get the inspiration? Like, I guess you watch the match, you read the book, or do you get the inspiration from any special country, or like the country which use the small side games most?
I think across Europe, I have to be very careful, because I think the quality of the coaching in Slavia is obviously very high. But one of the things that I've noticed in Czech football is that the small-sided game, or any kind of game, is often an opportunity for a coach in Czech Republic in general to put their feet up and just watch and let the kids play. Whereas if you look at examples from Holland, so I mentioned an example of the total football and Ajax, and that Johan Cruyff mentality of kind of the game being one of the most important elements of the session. And you look at, for example, in England, as I kind of provided some materials from the English FA and how they see intervention as important and the methodology of intervention. In sessions in England, I think it's gone the other way too much, where coaches coach too much in the game and they stop the game because they want to be like Guardiola and they want to kind of be the boss. Whereas I think, as I said in the presentation, it's something that you have to, it's like a balance, You can't do what a lot of coaches seem to do in Czech Republic and say nothing and do nothing. But at the same time, you can't do what a lot of coaches do in England, where they talk too much and they stop the kids from playing. It has to be some kind of middle ground. And so I would say that the inspiration is from a lot of different countries. Even in Taiwan, we used to have to coach quite a lot because there's not really a football culture there. So we would have to, in the small-sided game, we would have to coach a lot, and we would have to stop the session a lot and explain a lot of tactical principles, just because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of football culture. And so I would say that the experience that I've had in different countries and reading about small-sided games in different countries, I think is probably the main inspiration behind this presentation. And I think that in terms of what I've seen at Slavia, it's something that I think personally we could work a lot on going forward. It's something that I've talked to with my coaching team quite a lot, that I feel quite passionately about.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Here's the first question from our guest. Is there some nice public small games library on a website from England or others?
I haven't seen any library. I mean, if you look at a lot of websites, like the examples that I've used, I've got from my experience. As I said, we used a lot of them in Slavia in the sessions ourselves. But in terms of like a resource, I haven't really found any specific resource. But if you, there are lots of different websites that you can go to, and it's a minefield out there because you get a lot of ideas that are perhaps not suitable for every kind of situation. Some of the small-sided games aren't great, but as a coach, I think it comes down to how good you are at knowing your players and kind of thinking about what will work and what doesn't work, as I talked about in the presentation. So, but in terms of a library, I wouldn't say that there is. To be honest, I don't really agree with the fact that you can just copy and paste a drill or an exercise from someone else. There was one instance in Taiwan where I was coaching under 13, and these kids were good in terms of Taiwan, but they're nowhere near professional level. And I went in and I saw some exercise from Mourinho, and I went in to try it, and it was just too complicated. It didn't work. You can't copy and paste exercises from other coaches. It's what works best for you. And I think that the best exercises that you can do are the ones that you've created with inspiration from other people.
Okay, great, thank you. I have another question. You talked about stopping the game, but if you, let's say, if you think about the new game, about new small side game, and you will introduce new player, and when and how do you stop the game, or do you change the rules for how long you will keep the players play, but the play wouldn't look like you want?
I think it's a good point. Obviously,
because I asked that quite in Czech Republic they introduce new small side games, but for the players, because it's the new activities, new game, they don't get in the way the coach likes. So they just say, okay, we will, for example, make bigger space and we will solve the problem, and the problem is solved by coach but not the players. So how long do you like patient with the game or the view on the game?
I think obviously patience in all coaching is important, isn't it? But I think it sounds like I'm not really answering the question. I don't want to sound like a politician, but it really does depend on your players. And for example, if you're coaching, like I will take our example of coaching our under 11s, and they're very young, they're very talented, they've got a lot of skill, but they make a lot of mistakes. And I think that you have to be with that category, that we try to be as patient as possible. This is something that we've talked about as a coaching team, and I think there are many coaches out there because of ego, is that they see that the session or the game isn't working, and they see it as some kind of, oh, this makes me look bad. Whereas actually it's a process, isn't it? You know, I think that's important, that you understand that sometimes your game will work and sometimes it won't work, and kids are kids as well. So sometimes things go wrong anyway. You could have a great small-sided game. It looks great on paper. You know exactly how it's going to look. And then one kid or two kids will be having a bad day. They can't focus, or they can't concentrate, and your whole small-sided game's broken, you know. But I think the strength of a good coach comes from the fact that you understand that, and then maybe you come back, you know, a week later and you try it again, and you might have a different result. I think it's all about the observation, as was written in the presentation. It's that observation, and it's understanding why it's failing. Is it failing because the players are not concentrated? Okay, maybe the small-sided game is too complicated for them. Maybe it's your problem. Maybe is it the same player with the problem all the time? Maybe he's had a bad day, therefore it's not a problem with the small-sided game. Maybe it is too small and your players can't control the ball, and maybe you might want to think about changing it. There are so many factors really that you can't really. It depends on the coach and how good he is at observing, you know, and understanding why things are happening. So.
Okay, great answer. Thank you. So, any more questions from our guests? If you want to talk, you just unmute your microphone and you can talk directly to Jonathan. So maybe one more question from my side. How many aims do you think the small side games could have? It's like, well, aims or the topics. How many goals?
Yeah.
Or maybe like it's
do you mean like
two is already too many?
Do you mean like in each small-sided game? So, for example, like 20 minutes, a 20-minute small-sided game, like how many focuses there should be?
Yes, I would say like this. Yeah.
Again, it depends. Like if you're coaching under 17 or under 16, maybe they can deal with 3, 4, 5 points. Whereas if you're coaching under 9, under 10, maybe 2 or 1 or 2 might be enough. If you're coaching at a professional academy, you might be able to get away with more. If you're coaching an amateur team that you see once, twice per week, then maybe one is sufficient. Again, it's about knowing your players and what they're capable of doing, and what's too much and what's not enough. I think it's about understanding that it's not about you as a coach, and that you have to be Guardiola and giving 6 or 7 instructions in a game. It's, sometimes 1 or 2 delivered well is better than 7 or 8 that are half delivered and that don't get to your players, So, and I think also it's important because this is something that I've learned being at Slavia as an English speaker. The communication is obviously really important with what I do, and so it's almost limited what I can do in the session. And so now I'm going into a session or into an exercise and I'm only thinking about 2 or 3 points, because I know that a lot of my players don't speak English. So if I go in and speak to them about 5 or 6 different topics, then they're not going to understand it. Whereas if I go in with 1 or 2, then they understand it. And there are certain ideas that I take through all of the small-sided games that we do. So a lot of my players, the under-11s, they make fun of me because I'm always saying, check the space. And so this is something, that awareness is something that I'm trying to build through every single activity. And now they understand it. And now that, that it's like step by step. And so I think your communication's got to be on point, and you have to keep it simple.
Great. Again, thank you for the answer. There is another question from Jindřich. Have you got any experience with no equal small side games like 2v3 or 3v4?
Say again. Sorry.
Have you got any experience with no equal small side games like 2v3 or 3v4?
Yeah, we do. We work on a lot in our category. We do a lot of 3v2s, 2v1s. We work on that quite a lot because we find ourselves in that situation a lot in matches, because we play usually seven or six 6+1. So this means that there are lots of opportunities in 3v2 and 2v1s. So we do try to work on that. In terms of numerical disadvantage, so 2v3s, we don't really work on that at under 11 because we want them to succeed. So it's easier because it's also about confidence. You know, if you're doing 2v3s and your players are failing, your two players are failing, then they're going to lose interest at under 11. So what we try to do is make sure that they have 4v2 or they have 4v3, something like that, so that the attacking team get success. So that's what we try to do as much as possible. But we have lots of examples. We've worked a lot on transition over the last kind of 8-9 months, and obviously in the transition you do need those overloads in order to create the change of possession. You know, to lose possession to gain possession, you need those overloads. If you have the 3v2 and 4v2, because you've got one side with the numerical advantage, you usually have a lot of changes of possession. Whereas, you know, if you have even numbers, it's not such a big deal. So yeah, we try to do that as much as possible.
Okay, great. Another question from Ondra. Hi, John. What do you think about number of players in our competition games? For example, under 10 plus 1, 5 plus 1, under 11. Maybe better if you open the chat. There is a.
How do? I'm gonna figure out.
Just next to share screen.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what do you think about the number of players in our competition games, for example, under 10, 5 plus 1? Yeah, I think that in England, I think we do things a little bit differently. I think we're a little bit more careful about how we approach these kinds of numbers in different age categories. My personal opinion is that under 11, I think it works better under 11 if it is 7 plus 1, if there's a little bit more. But again, this is the professional academies. So if you're seeing your players 4 times a week as we do, then working on 7 plus 1, 6 plus 1 is a lot easier for us, because we get a lot of time to go situations with them. I think if you only see your players once or twice a week, perhaps it's a lot easier then to play 5 plus 1 or 4 plus 1. It's a lot easier. So I think that we're fortunate at Slavia because we get to see our players a lot, and so we can really get into the detail of 7 plus 1, and we can kind of we're more adaptable. Whereas I guess if some of the local Czech teams, when they see their players 2-3 times a week, it's more difficult to then incorporate that into the small-sided games. But really, I mean, from what I've seen in Czech Republic, I think I don't really have too much of a problem with it. I think perhaps under 11, knowing our players and what they're capable of, I think that you could probably get away with 7 plus 1, 8 plus 1. But of course, it's about catering for everybody in Czech Republic. So a lot of the teams that we play, apart from Sparta and maybe 1 or 2 others, they have to keep it simple because they don't have the resources and the time that we have. So yeah, I hope that's answered the question really.
Yep, I guess you did.
Any more questions?
So looks like there's no more question. Maybe last minute.
Okay. Well, I do find it quite interesting as well with Andre's question, that it's quite good for us really that we have, for example, like a 5+1 or a 6+1, because you can break those down into like a 2v2 or 3v3 or those kinds of small-sided games. It's easier. Whereas if you played 8+1 or 9+1, it would perhaps be a little bit more difficult then to incorporate the small-sided games. Like, for example, I feel that with our under 11 category, having the 3v3 is perhaps the limit to what they can achieve, you know, in terms of it being understandable for them. Once you get onto 4v4, 5v5, then it's more difficult. So if you put that in the context of 6+1 or a 7+1, having that 3v3 times 2 effectively, if you have 6+1, the 3v3, I think is perhaps, in terms of their development, it's probably a good thing. If we're bringing it back to the small-sided games.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if it's no more question, I would like to thank you again. It was really pleasure to watch and listen your presentation. And well, yeah, I record the presentation, and so if you would like get a copy and link for this recording, just drop your email to my Twitter account or to Facebook, or you can contact Jonathan directly. You will get this link as well. And yeah, well, thanks for coming. Next week there will be another presentation about Red Bull Salzburg Academy on Monday in Czech, and on Thursday there will be another topic from my colleague from US, DC, Washington. Yeah, that's it from my side. Jonathan, if you have any more words for the end?
Not really. I just hope that everyone understood it. I know that for some people the English might have been difficult, so I just hope it was understandable and informative, and it was a lot of fun to make and to produce. So thank you. Thanks to Matti as well for hosting it. Thank you very much.
Okay, you are mostly welcome. Okay, everybody, thanks for coming, and have a good night or day. Depends where you are right now. Good night. Thank you, Jonathan.